Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Matthias, and in this tutorial I want to show you how to compose such a wound here onto this head. Okay, so this here is the original footage that we start with, and our end result will somehow look like this. Or actually, this is not yet a final result, but I show you how to even improve it a little further. The short story is actually this looks quite complicated because you see here some kind of perspective distortion is going on, and so the good news is I've created a script with which such kind of compositing becomes really simple. So the basically 10 seconds version of the tutorial would be take your original footage, take a layer with an image of this wound looking like this, select tracking data with that you tracked with Mocha, import it here into my script, select the appropriate option and hit apply, and now you are basically done. Okay, this is a 10 seconds version of the tutorial. Actually, I show you how to do this even better, and I also hope that from the tutorial you don't only learn how to perform exactly this specific task, but I actually want you to learn a very general technique how you do compositing, or how you can do compositing much easier in general. So I think a very general thing that you face all the time is, well, compositing is much about just matching stuff. So one thing that you, for example, want to match is the color. So the thing you want to composite should be similar in their color such that it looks real. Second, you want to match movement. So if here some movement is going on, then the thing you want to composite also have to move appropriately. So also if you have some kind of camera movement or whatever, usually you have to do some kind of tracking. And usually all this becomes quite complicated if also some perspective changes go on, as you can see here. Okay, this rotation of the head and all that makes it usually quite difficult. And in After Effects, what you can do if you've got perspective changes, either you can go to 3D space, so put this layer here, make this layer with a wound a 3D layer, and rotate and whatever do to make it match, but this is usually quite complex. And the second option that you have is that you do some kind of corner pinning, because with the corner pin you also get some level of perspective distortion, and this makes stuff very easy, and or at least much easier than really working in 3D space. And actually with my script this gets much easier, and I hope that you can use this technique really in a lot of different applications and not only for this specific task. Okay, we will consider basically three main parts to obtain all this here. The first is we are going to create an image of this wound here in Photoshop. The second is that we are going to track the movement here and this perspective change in Mocha for After Effects, which is included in After Effects CS4. And finally, we are going to do then the compositing stuff in After Effects. Okay, so here we are now in Photoshop, and what we want to do in Photoshop is that we want to create the wound on top of the head in the first frame of our footage. So the basic idea is that we take the wound from another picture looking like this and compose it onto the image, onto the first frame here in Photoshop. And so in detail we do the following. To obtain this, we open here the first frame of the clip. In my case, the clip was already a TIFF sequence, so you can just open the first TIFF and have the first frame. If you've got the film in one file, then you have to export the frame from After Effects as a Photoshop file, for example. And so then we open also the other image this one. Actually, this was a test to create, so this is a fake wound that this was more or less an exercise for my film project. Just took a picture of it, and now we can roughly draw here a rectangular mask around it and go to Edit, Copy. So I'm sorry for the German user interface, but I was not able to change that actually. So we copied this, go back in here and say Edit, Paste. In German bearbeiten, einfügen. Now we can select this layer and rotate it and scale it such that it more or less roughly fits our comp here. So if you want to scale it, you can hold down Shift such that it is not distorted. Maybe roughly like this. Let's give this layer a name by double clicking on it. Let's call this wound original, because we will later also have a modified version. We select the layer and now we roughly draw a mask around it. Roughly like this. Now we go to selection, and actually I don't know how this is called in the English interface. I guess something like improve border or improve edge, something like that. Okay, and now you've got a preview of your selection, and everything that is red is not in your selection, everything that else. So yeah, it's not good to see here. If I extend this a little, you can see that here this part is not tinted in red, so this is our selection. This here means something like extend the selection. Okay, just extend it a little bit, and weiche Kante means feathering, so we feather it a little bit. Maybe like this. It's just important that you've got some kind of feathering. And now we hit, with the layer selected and the selection, we hit this button here, which then creates here kind of an alpha channel. Yeah, for that out of our selection we created kind of alpha channel, such that now you've got the wound here cut out basically. This is much nicer than just deleting everything around, because now you can modify it later. So if you don't have this one here selected, but here this is alpha channel, then you can actually paint on it. So for example, you can now, so black you see is everything that is transparent. So if I've got a black color selected with some brush, I can just here tighten my selection, for example. I will undo that. Okay, and similarly you can, oops, you can select white color to extend your selection. So maybe let's take a little bigger brush like this, and then you can see here slightly increase your selection. I will undo this out. Also just the idea, so you don't throw anything away. If you've got these alpha channels here, you can always modify your selection later. But actually we don't do that, but we duplicate layer. Here I right click on this and say here duplicate layer and call it wound color corrected, because now we are going to color correct it. So actually this duplication of the layer is not really necessary, but actually I like to keep a copy of the original and make it just invisible, such that when I color correct it, I can always compare it to the original, or also go back, start from new, from the original version, if the color correction somehow didn't look that nice. And so I go here to image, correct. Oh, I have to select the color correction layer here, the one that is visible. Go to image corrections, probably it's translated. And then I go to Tonwertkorrektur, which in English is just levels. Okay, and then you can see that here the wound is much brighter than the rest of the image. So I make it darker by lowering this value here. And you can see now that it's already much more convincing. Okay, still a little bit gray here around the wound. So I will just go to the red channel here, not RGB, but only red, or German Rot, and correct it separately. So you see if I bring this here down, it already looks more convincing. Just play around a little here with the values. I think this already looks quite satisfying. Maybe like this. Okay, and then you can save this file and just import this layer here, just the layer with the wound on it, in After Effects. So I won't save it because I will work with this version here. This is really exactly the same. I did it just before and maybe took a little bit more time for the color correction. So maybe it just looks a little bit more convincing. Therefore, I will continue with this file here. Okay, so now we have the wound on the first frame, and in order to get it on the other frames too, we need to take care of the movement, and therefore we have to track the movement, and we do this with Mocha, in this case with Mocha for After Effects version 1, which ships with After Effects CS4. So we start a new project, select here our clip to import. So in this case, the clip is a TIFF sequence, and I just select the first image, and it will recognize all the others automatically. I give it a name like wound track. Click next. Here everything is okay. The frame rate is in our case 25 frames per second, and the rest is okay too. Click finish. And now we've got here our clip. And so what we want to track is we want to do a corner pin track, and we want to track something that is more or less the area of the head that the wound is placed on. Okay, so we really roughly draw a mask around that part, and it's really important that you just track roughly this part here, because you want to track a part that is more or less a flat part of the head, and so you don't want to track here the entire head, because we are really interested in the plane here in which the wound is lying. And now we can make sure that here everything, including perspective, is selected, and just hit here this track forward button to start the tracking. So now our track is finished, looking like this. And what we now do is that we enable here this surface, and now draw or put the surface here roughly in this area. So you can also enable here the grid to see. So we need basically to have a plane that is approximately the plane in which our wound is lying. So obviously the surface where the wound is located on is not flat, but we want to basically approximate this with a flat surface, maybe looking like this. And now you can also see that as the head is turning, quite some perspective change in this surface is taking place. Right? We go to export tracking data, select CS4 corner pin data, and save it to some file. And actually I also have prepared this already in advance, so I've got here already a file phase tracks that we are going to use. I will briefly open the project to show you that I did nothing else in there. This one. Okay. So this was a track that I did before, and if I enable here the surface of this layer, you can see that it's really similar. Okay, just same kind of track. So we are going to work with this track now. And now we can open this with the MochaImport script. Phase track. And we will now import this layer into After Effects. So we go to our project, right click, import file, select this wound file, choose import as footage, and we don't want a merge of all layers, but we just want this wound color corrected layer. Okay, and so let's drag our footage here into a new comp, original footage, and then we can place a wound on top of it, and well, on the first frame it exactly matches because this is a frame on which we worked in Photoshop. And now we have already pasted the tracking data here, so we can just use this red giant warp corner pin with this keep frame option such that the current frame remains unchanged, and hit apply. Now we've got a corner pin where this wound here is nicely moving with the head. Looking like this. So I'm not going to explain you now in detail all the functions of this script here, of my script to import the Mocha data. If you're not familiar with it yet, please visit my website where you will find two other tutorials about it. One that shows you the general functions of it, and another one that shows you in particular these red giant warp functions that we are also using in this tutorial. So if you're not familiar with those, please watch this other tutorial first. So from now on I will just assume that you are familiar with the basic idea of these functions. Okay, so this is already looking quite good, but actually we can even do better. So one thing that we can do better is, well, we can take care about motion blur. Okay, because there is quite some motion going on and also some blur. And if you look at this star here, at these three functions, and you read carefully, you see that this only works with Mocha 1.0 data. Okay, and Mocha 1.0 corner pin does not support motion blur. This is only, you get motion blur only if you buy version 2.0 of Mocha. But the good thing is that this red giant warp corner pin automatically supports motion blur. So the only thing you have to do to get motion blur is actually turn on the motion blur on the layer and turn on the motion blur of the comp, and you see immediately here you have your motion blur. Okay, motion blur off, motion blur on. You directly get it. There's a second thing that we can do better. I will turn off it again to get a better speed. Actually, we can do it even more precise, so the distortion that is going on here, if we want to have more control about all the details, we can do it differently. So I delete this layer again, and what I do is I use this last function here, this red giant warp pre-comp selected layer, and hit apply. So now we've got a pre-comp of exactly this area, and I again drag in a copy of our footage behind and go into this pre-comp. In this pre-comp we have this distortion control layer with the shrink X and shrink Y effects to make it look better as we need it, maybe like this. I can see here it is fairly well stabilized and undistorted in this area that we need, Okay, but there's still some perspective change going on. And this is because, well, this here is not just a flat surface, but this is actually a complex 3D structure, and therefore there's much more distortion going on than you could capture with a simple corner pin. And so we can now again drag in our wound and scale it up a little and modify it such that it fits maybe like this, roughly, right? And if we go back to our original comp, you can see we have got basically the same as before. The wound nicely moving, and in this I will lower here the opacity again to show it to you. So in this case here, this is a layer on which we are actually working. This is our pre-comp, right? We work basically in this distorted setting here, and in this distorted pre-comp we now can do some further tweaking. So you can see here at this part some more distortion takes place, and actually also the wound should have this distortion. Okay, so we can apply an effect to it. Effect, distort, mesh warp. And now we can keyframe this motion really roughly. So I go into the effect, set a keyframe for distort mesh, and now move here where this part has moved to the right, and also move this mesh here accordingly. Maybe like this. Now you can see that the wound nicely distorts here with the rest of the head. Okay, it also seems to turn a little, and this finally causes that here our distortion here also looks more realistic. Okay, so you can basically correct your distortion here at a fine-grained level with this mesh warp effect. Okay, one thing we have to take here about is again the motion blur. Namely, if you now enable for such a pre-comp this motion blur, we actually get the additional motion blur as expected, but you get it, well, for this entire layer. So here this entire region is moving, but this footage here already has its motion blur, right? So for this one, you don't really want, you want to have motion blur on the wound, but you don't want additional motion blur on this. Okay, you can see here if I deactivate the layer compared to activating it, you get here motion blur on this entire image and not just on the wound. And to avoid this, you can, in the pre-comp here, just deactivate this background layer such that in this pre-comp only the wound is visible. And then here you will also have only additional motion blur on the wound. Okay, this is original, this is with the wound. And I think now it really looks pretty convincing with this distortion and the involved motion blur. Okay, so finally I want to mention that I think that this technique is really flexible, that you can use it in many different cases. So I guess you can, for example, also not just use to compose stuff onto your image, but also if you want to do some removal. So if you have some wire removal, for example. So to show you this, maybe let's go back again here into this pre-comp and say we want not to compose here such a wound on top of it, but we want to remove something. Okay, I mean, okay, this here, does it look like a wire? Maybe it's not wire removal, but you can imagine here would instead be some wire and we whatever for want to remove it. Okay, So we could, for example, duplicate our background layer, and in this duplicate, draw here a mask, roughly like this. Okay, maybe this is a little bit too tight on the part that we want to remove. Okay, and then just move this downwards and feather the mask a little bit. Maybe like this. And you can see that more or less, yeah, this is removed. Okay, and very quick and dirty basically, but with a pretty convincing result. So if you look at the original composition, here in this stabilized setting, it is much more easy to remove something than if you had to paint it out in each frame, or if you wanted to keyframe this, it would be much more work than this. And the idea to copy and paste basically parts of the image is just one option that you have. You can also use this clone stamp tool in the pre-comp or whatever. So I think it's a really flexible and also quite easy to use technique, because you just have to track, just have to do a corner pin track, and then use my script here, choose this pre-comp selected layer option, and you immediately get your pre-comp with this nice distortion control and all that automatically built in. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.